Isaiah chapter 6 begins with a powerful statement. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. This text carries a very profound spiritual meaning. However, many people do not fully understand the purpose of these words from the prophet. Some preachers in their messages go so far as to say that Uzziah was blocking Isaiah's ministry, as if Isaiah could only see the glory of God and have a true encounter with him after the king's death. But is that really what Isaiah meant? Was Uzziah truly preventing the calling of one of the most important prophets in the Bible? Uzziah, the king of Judah, was a great ruler, but his story had a tragic ending. He started well, but at the end of his life, due to a serious mistake, he was struck with leprosy and died in isolation. So, does this have anything to do with Isaiah's ministry? Did Uzziah symbolize something that was preventing Isaiah from having a greater connection with God? So, what really happened in the year that Uzziah died? If you want to understand the meaning of this vision and the impact it had on Isaiah's life, watch this video until the end. Let's understand the details of Isaiah's vision that are often overlooked in this rich and mysterious story. To better understand what happened in the year that King Uzziah died, it is important to know what was happening in history and spirituality at that time. Uzziah was one of the most important kings of Judah, and his reign left a lasting impact on the country. He reigned for 52 years, bringing much prosperity and security to the people. During his reign, Judah experienced a period of growth and success. Uzziah strengthened the army, built walls in Jerusalem, and encouraged agriculture, which boosted the economy. In the beginning, he was a king who sought God, and for that reason was greatly blessed. Despite starting well, Uzziah's reign ended with a great spiritual downfall. The Bible tells us that he allowed pride to take over, which ultimately led to his own destruction. Uzziah's main mistake was his pride. In a moment of arrogance, he entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense, something only the priests were allowed to do. This was a serious disobedience to God's rules, as Uzziah, being a king, did not have permission to perform duties that were reserved exclusively for the priests. When the priests tried to stop him, Uzziah became very angry. At that moment, God punished him with leprosy, a disease that not only made him physically impure, but also separated him from society and his role as a leader. Uzziah had to live in isolation until the end of his life, far from the temple and away from people. His death, after many years of living isolated due to leprosy, marked a great change for the kingdom of Judah. Uzziah's death marked the end of a period of prosperity, and Judah's future became uncertain. Furthermore, his death, which occurred around 740 or 739 before Christ, coincided with a time of great changes on the international scene. Assyria, a nation that was growing in power, began threatening the surrounding countries, and Judah was also at risk. The stability that Judah enjoyed during Uzziah's reign was under threat, and the future seemed worrisome. It was in this moment of uncertainty and change that Isaiah had his vision of God. When Isaiah mentions Uzziah's death at the beginning of chapter 6, it is no coincidence. In fact, he was showing the contrast between two realities: the death of a human king and the eternity of God, the heavenly king. This vision of Isaiah is one of the most incredible descriptions of God in the entire Bible. Isaiah saw God seated on a throne, which shows God's absolute control over the entire universe. While Isaiah and the people of Judah were going through difficult times on earth, in heaven, the situation was quite different. Uzziah had died, but God remained alive, governing in an immutable and sovereign way. The contrast is clear. Uzziah's throne was empty, but God's throne remained occupied, for he reigns forever. This shows us that even with the changes and crises we face on earth, God's power is never shaken. Isaiah described God's throne as high and exalted. which means that God is far above all creation in holiness, power, and majesty. He cannot be compared to anything or anyone on earth. He is beyond what we can understand. In the vision, Isaiah saw that the hem of God's robe filled the temple, representing his presence and glory. The temple, which was a sacred place in the Old Testament, could not contain all of God's glory. This teaches us that God is not limited to a specific place. His presence cannot be confined to just one place or structure. He is everywhere and transcends all creation. The proof of this is that around God's throne, Isaiah saw seraphim, who are angels, continuously crying out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." The repetition of holy 3 times shows just how perfectly holy God is. In Hebrew culture, repeating something was a way to emphasize it. So saying holy 3 times means that God's holiness is complete and absolute. Even though they are celestial and sinless beings, the seraphim covered their faces and feet as a sign of respect and humility, acknowledging that, despite their purity, they were not worthy to look directly at God's glory. Faced with this magnificent vision, Isaiah reacted immediately and deeply, saying, "Woe to me, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." Notice how God's holiness made Isaiah realize how sinful he was. He immediately felt his unworthiness and his mistakes. His first reaction was one of despair, saying, "Woe to me, I am ruined." These words show how distressed he became. Upon seeing God's holiness, Isaiah realized how far he was from being pure. He understood that his lips were unclean and that he was not worthy to worship and serve such a holy God. In the face of this holiness, he felt condemned. This type of reaction is natural when someone has a true encounter with the holiness of God. The person realizes how incapable they are of reaching God's perfect standard. This is what Isaiah felt. And he didn't stop there, as he also recognized that the people around him were equally sinful. Upon seeing the Lord of hosts, Isaiah understood that both he and all his people were unworthy before God and deserved his judgment. In that moment, there was no room for justification or trying to appear better, because, in the face of God's holiness, all human pretense disappears. After Isaiah acknowledged his sins, something surprising happened. The Bible tells us that one of the seraphim flew to him with a live coal, which had been taken from the altar with tongs. The seraph touched Isaiah's mouth with this coal and said that his sins had been forgiven. This act of purification was highly symbolic and essential to prepare Isaiah for the mission that God had for him. The live coal, taken from the altar, symbolized the purification that only God can give. In the temple, the altar was the place where sacrifices were made so that sins could be forgiven. Therefore, this coal represented sacrifice and the removal of sins. The fact that the seraph touched Isaiah's lips was significant because he had confessed that his lips were unclean. This touch represented the cleansing of his sins and prepared Isaiah to be God's messenger. Without this purification, he could not fulfill the mission that God had for him. After that, Isaiah heard the voice of God asking, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Isaiah immediately responded, "Here I am, send me." Although it seemed like an open question, there was a sense of urgency. God was looking for someone willing to commit to doing his will. God's mission is urgent and ever-present, and he seeks people willing to face the challenges of that mission. After being purified and renewed, Isaiah understood the importance of God's invitation and was ready to accept it. When he responded, "Here I am," he was showing that he was fully willing to serve. He did not hesitate or ask what the mission would require. Isaiah offered himself completely to be used by God, demonstrating that he understood the magnitude of the calling and the greatness of the one who was calling him. He simply said, "Send me." Isaiah did not point to someone else or run away from the calling. He made himself available to do God's work. This total surrender from Isaiah was a direct result of the encounter he had with God's holiness and the purification he received. However, he knew that accepting the call would not be easy. Isaiah knew he would be sent to a rebellious and stubborn people who often would not listen to his message. Even so, he did not give up. His willingness to be sent showed his courage, which came from his faith and the certainty that God was with him. God revealed to Isaiah that instead of bringing immediate repentance, his preaching would further harden the hearts of the people. This was surprising, as it seemed to go against the purpose of preaching. But this revelation showed the just side of God. The people of Judah had repeatedly rejected God's word, and now Isaiah's message would serve to confirm divine judgment. Even knowing that his work would seem in vain at first, Isaiah would have to preach faithfully. Isaiah's mission would be long and difficult, requiring much patience and perseverance. He would have to continue delivering his message until the land was empty and without inhabitants. But even with the impending judgment, God gave a promise of hope. He would keep a faithful remnant, even though this group would also go through difficult times to be purified. Just like an oak tree that, when cut down, leaves a stump that can produce new shoots, God would also preserve a portion of the people so that from it a new holy seed would arise. This pointed to the coming of the Messiah, for Christ would come from this lineage, bringing redemption. Thus, despite the difficulties, Isaiah's mission was part of God's plan to save humanity. All of this happened in the year that King Uzziah died. The mention of this event does not mean that Uzziah's presence hindered the manifestation of God's glory or the beginning of Isaiah's ministry. This interpretation is exaggerated and does not hold up when we analyze the historical and theological context more closely. Uzziah was one of the most important kings of Judah, ruling for 52 years and bringing much prosperity and stability to the people. Despite his sad end, Uzziah continued to be respected and loved in Judah. His death marked the end of a time of peace and the beginning of a period of uncertainty. The people who saw Uzziah as a source of security now faced an uncertain future. Isaiah's purpose in mentioning the year of Uzziah's death was not to suggest that the king of Judah hindered the manifestation of God. Instead, Isaiah wanted to show that God called him at a time of great crisis. Furthermore, the message is clear. Even when human leaders fail or die, God remains the true king. Uzziah, one of the greatest kings since Solomon had died, and his throne was empty. But Isaiah saw that the true throne of the nation and the world was not in Jerusalem, but in heaven, where God reigns sovereign and eternal. This also brings a lesson for us today. Many people place all their trust in human leaders, but this is dangerous and always leads to disappointment. We need to remember that human leaders, no matter how powerful or successful they may be, are fallible and temporary. Even the strongest rulers are subject to downfall and death. Human kingdoms and their projects are fleeting. Sooner or later, all thrones on earth become empty. But regardless of what happens in the world, God remains in control, seated on his eternal throne, far above any human problem or crisis. The earthly throne may be empty, but the heavenly throne will always be occupied. When King Uzziah died, this event brought a sense of emptiness and uncertainty to the people of Judah. They had lost a king who had ruled for 52 years, bringing prosperity and stability. It was natural for the people to feel helpless. After all, losing such an important leader was a hard blow to the nation. However, in the midst of this crisis, Isaiah learned a profound and powerful lesson. While the throne of a human king may be empty, the throne of God will never be unoccupied. It was at that moment that the Lord revealed to Isaiah that changes and uncertainties in human governments do not affect his sovereignty in the slightest. God continues to reign, no matter who is or isn't in power on earth. The agenda of human rulers, with their flaws and limitations, never threatens God's perfect plan. To human eyes, the end of Uzziah's reign seemed like a time of mourning and despair. The people were without direction, and the future seemed bleak. But in God's eyes, that was the perfect moment to begin a new phase in His divine plan. The Lord used that time of transition to commission Isaiah as His prophet, someone who would bring a message of judgment and purification, but also of hope and restoration. Isaiah was chosen to announce that despite the chaos and discouragement, God was in control. He would speak of the judgment that would come upon Judah because of its sins, but also of the restoration that would come through a faithful remnant. And more importantly, Isaiah would be the messenger who pointed to the coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who would bring redemption to all humanity. Uzziah's death marked the end of an era of relative peace, but it also began a period of preparation for something much greater. The Lord showed Isaiah that history was not determined by human kings, but by the heavenly King who reigns eternally. Even in the moments of greatest uncertainty and mourning, God was preparing the way for the fulfillment of His promises. Isaiah's call in that moment of transition reminds us that God is always at work. Even when it seems like everything around us is falling apart, He is the eternal King, and His throne will never be empty. Therefore, at no point does this text teach us that we should eliminate a supposed Uzziah that is hindering our communion with God. The idea that something or someone must be removed so that we can draw closer to God is not the focus of the passage. What Isaiah's text truly shows is much deeper and more significant. It does not speak about human or physical obstacles that need to be removed from our lives in order for us to see the glory of God. This interpretation is an exaggerated allegory and does not align with the true meaning of the passage. What Isaiah's vision actually teaches us is that God is sovereign, regardless of external circumstances. Even when human leaders fail, or when we face times of crisis and uncertainty, the Lord continues to reign supreme, always present and in control of all things. The heavenly throne is never empty, and God's rule does not depend on earthly changes. He is eternal and unchanging, and nothing can threaten His authority. Like Isaiah, we are called to look beyond immediate and earthly circumstances. Many times, we are tempted to believe that if we removed certain obstacles or difficult situations, we could have a deeper communion with God. But what Isaiah's vision reminds us is that even in the midst of chaos, pain, or loss, God remains on the throne. True transformation and renewal happen not when we eliminate what bothers us, but when we look up and see the reality of divine governance, where God is sovereignly directing history. This vision also challenges us to trust God, even when the world around us seems to be falling apart. The people of Judah were in a moment of great uncertainty with the death of Uzziah, and many may have felt that everything was out of control. However, God showed Isaiah that even with the absence of an earthly king, He continued to govern the universe perfectly. This teaches us not to place our trust solely in human leaders, systems, or circumstances, but in God, who never fails and whose throne will never be empty. The main lesson here is that our communion with God does not depend on external circumstances, but on our willingness to recognize His sovereignty at all times. We are called to lift our eyes beyond earthly crises and trust in the eternal God who reigns over everything. Like Isaiah, we are invited to perceive the majesty and holiness of God, to live in the reality of His heavenly rule, and to trust that, regardless of difficulties, He is in control of all things. If you enjoyed this message, share it to bless more people's lives. Leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss future videos. May God bless you.